Well, that was a lot. Thank you. That was a lot. Two lengthy stories, pieces of story that we heard this morning, and we could do a lot with those. In fact, they're very long stories, so I'm assuming you're expecting this message to be at least half an hour, if not a little bit longer. Don't turn off. The thing is, it's going to be actually kind of short because you're going to do all the heavy lifting afterwards. Because the thing about those two stories is they are part of bigger stories, and yet by themselves, there's a lot in there, right? So we could Bible study these to death, or I could just tell you about a particular perspective that I'm thinking about when I hear these two stories, and then we can think about that. Because perspective is everything in these two stories, and it's how they connect. So the first is just a piece of the Exodus story, right? The Hebrew people have been led out of Egypt. In fact, they've already been complaining a little bit. Now they're complaining some more. They're going to still complain some more. The thing is, this is a story that happens as part of their journey into being a nation, to being a people, the people Israel. It's part of the journey. It's a moment in the journey. So there's two things to consider there. One is the bigger picture of the journey, and the second is being in this moment. The second story is a story Jesus tells, and within the story itself, oh my goodness, there's a lot. There's a lot of ways that you can interpret this story and lots of things that you can say about this story and little bits and details in it that you can examine. And it also kind of depends, when you look at this story, it kind of depends on whether you see it as being a social justice commentary or whether you see it as being about faith. Or those two things together, because they're not separable, which is where I go. So when you look at that story, you need to consider being in that story for a minute, but also the bigger picture of Jesus constantly talking about what the kingdom of heaven is like. How do those two stories connect? Well, both of them apparently seem to feature some complaining. Both of them feature an action that brings what's needed to everyone, not necessarily what's wanted in either case, but what's needed. And both are, in many ways, a response to, here's where we are, where are we going to? So, the Exodus story, they're on their way, right? And they're on the way to the promised land, but let's leave the geography aside for a second. What they're really on their way to is learning how to be a community. That's what this whole story of the 40 years in the wilderness, all that time in the wilderness, is about. It's learning how to be community, to be together, to be a congregation that is a community. This is part of their learning. Well, what are they learning here? They were hungry, and they were ready to go back to Egypt. Not the first time, by the way, but they're ready to go back because no matter how bad that was, they at least had food, you know. No matter how bad that was, we at least knew where we were at. Now we have no idea, and we're hungry. I have a feeling that right now it should not be too hard for you to find yourself in this story as one of the Hebrew people. We're not really sure where we're at or where we're going, but we remember when. Yeah. The problem with that thinking, but the problem with thinking that we can, say, make a nation or a community or a people or anything great again is that you think there was a time when it was. And I can guarantee you, whatever time you personally thought it was great or better, I can find you what's wrong with that. Because we remember our own perspective, right? So it'd be nice to think, the blissful 60s, that's the decade I was born in, so it must be great. I'm sure there were lots of things great about it, but there's also lots of things that weren't. There was lots of struggle. There were lots of things around civil rights and people being who they are, people being fed, poverty. There's so many things. Wherever you go, you're going to find that. Because nostalgically, how we remember things is how we remember things. It may not be how everyone remembers things. And sometimes we're more comfortable with how things were, even if they were bad, because at least we knew. And when we're in a period of change and we don't know, that's more uncomfortable. That's where these guys are. They're out in the middle of the desert. They've got no food. Okay, so we've been rescued from Egypt. We're no longer slaves. Okay, so we've been rescued from the Pharaoh's army. Okay, fine, but we're still hungry. The thing is, yes, you are. And what happens here? What happens here? God is with you. So whether you take this story literally or not, the fact is that the people are fed on their journey. It's part of the journey. But we can sure identify with the struggle of, we were more comfortable back there. Think of how many people you might have heard saying things like, it'll be great to get back to normal. That's usually followed by somebody saying, normal? What the hell did you think that was? That's not normal. We can do better. And that's the thing is, when somebody says to you, we can do better, it's not a criticism. We can always do better. No matter how great we think we can do, we can always do better. And we should always be looking to do that, especially when it comes to things like making sure people are fed. We can always do better. But it's part of the journey. So here's two perspectives there, right? You put yourself in the story, and that can be hard work. If you put yourself in the story as one of the Hebrew people. If you look at that story from the outside and go, oh yes, well clearly this is an important learning. Fine. But you've distanced yourself from their position, haven't you? So put yourself in that story for a few minutes and think about what it would be like to be lost in the wilderness with no food, with somebody leading you that you don't really know all that well, except you kind of think they're supposed to be from God, but you're not really sure where we're going. It's a struggle. The big picture, of course, is we're going somewhere, and that somewhere is the promised land, whether that's actually a physical place or just a way of being as a community. We're going to the promised land. So Jesus tells this story, and we're later on in the Gospel of Matthew too, right? We've had a few weeks now of the Gospel of Matthew. We've got a few weeks more, and we've heard stories about inclusiveness and conflict and how to deal with that. And here we are at a story about a guy who owns some land, who hires some people, and then he pays them all the same. And the ones who were hired first aren't too happy about that because they think the ones who were hired last should get less. So let's just be clear, by the way. The ones who were hired first thought they were being treated fairly. They just think these people should get less. I'm just going to say that again. These people should get less because they didn't work as hard. And the landowner says, nope, everybody gets the same. We made a deal. Everybody gets the same. The thing is, that story is prefaced with, the kingdom of God is like. So the kingdom of God apparently isn't perfect. The kingdom of God is a place where stuff gets done to you, whether you like it or not. If you put yourself in the position of the person who was hired first, that's what it feels like. You got to the end of the day, you thought you were going to be treated fairly. You don't think that's fair because that's not your perspective. Your perspective isn't, I should get what I need, as we all should. Your perspective is, I earned more. I earned it. It would be really easy to look at this story from the outside and go, yes, but clearly the kingdom of God is about everyone being treated fairly and getting what they need. It's about equity, right? Everyone has what they need. It's a place where there's, I'm just going to throw this in, it's a place where there's a basic income for everybody. Everyone gets what they need. Thing is, if you put yourself in the story, the kingdom of God is not like that at all. You followed on from the end of the story and presumed what the kingdom of God will be based on this story, which is just the piece of a story. It doesn't end where this little vignette ends. Because if you're the guys who were hired first, you didn't go home happy. You didn't go, oh, yes, of course, you're absolutely right. This is how it should be. You went home feeling angry and devalued. You probably went to the marketplace the next morning to warn people about this guy who's hiring people and not treating them fairly, which probably won't get you very far because that was at a time when people were moving into the cities and laborers were a dime a dozen, or a denarius a dozen. The point is, you're not going to feel like that's okay. So really, in fact, the kingdom of heaven appears to be a place where there's some struggle. The kingdom of heaven appears to be a place where things are imposed upon you, whether they're right or not. They are imposed upon you. This is how it's going to be. And the thing about that is, let's tie those two perspectives together for a second. Because we're really quick to say things like the kingdom of heaven is where we go next. You know, the place of perfectness. And this certainly isn't that. Except Jesus is always talking about how the kingdom of heaven is near. Or here. And it is. We're struggling to find it and to make it happen. Maybe the kingdom of heaven is like this story. Except it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. Somebody needs to show some compassion to those workers who went away angry, as much as they need to show compassion to the people who needed to be hired. They needed that minimum basic income. They needed that. Somebody needs to find a way to connect the people who are grumbling and complaining because, you know, it used to be like this, and help them find a way forward into the new thing. Maybe part of being the kingdom of heaven isn't the destination. Maybe it isn't the promised land, it's the journey. Maybe it's the journey. Maybe it's the struggling and learning and growing and trying to figure out how we live our experiences and learn and grow in a way that it remains true to who we were from the start. Created in the image of God, children of God. Inherently good. Maybe that's part of being the kingdom of heaven. Always learning, always growing. being perfect for who we are, not who we might judge us to be. The stories are really tricky. Well, as they should be. Because it's really easy to stand outside them. And this is so often what we do. We stand outside and we look in and we go, yes, it's clearly about this. And yeah, that's great. That's super awesome. And it allows us to hold them at a distance and not have to struggle with what's inside them. And what's inside these stories is where we're at right now. For lots of people, between the pandemic and what's going on with civil rights and the LGBT community and cultures and religions and politics, what's going on with all that stuff has created an environment in which we don't really know where we're going next. Oh, sorry, I left out the natural disasters. The list is long, is the thing. In these two stories, that's the great thing about that's a part of the Exodus story. It's one piece of that little moment of the Exodus story where they're hungry. They're also going to be thirsty. They're also going to be afraid. They're also going to have to fight. They're also going to be, I think there's a snake thing too. There's a whole pile of stuff that they're going to experience in that journey to the promised land. Maybe Jesus means the kingdom of heaven is near is because we're that close to being the community that was intended, to being connected to each other, to finding grace and love, compassion and hope. We're struggling to get there. And God is with us on the journey, inspiring us. Jesus is teaching us as we go. The Spirit is there to inspire us, to keep us connected to each other, to invite us to struggle together. You can't just stand on the outside looking in and go, oh, well, we'll get there maybe one day. You have to get into the story. You have to live part of the story and be part of the journey. That's how we'll get there.